Sarah Martinez stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her fingers trembling as she applied concealer to the bruise on her cheek. The purple mark had faded to a sickly yellow-green, but it still served as a painful reminder of 3 nights ago when Derek had lost his temper again. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to smile at her reflection, practicing the expression she would need to wear at work today. At 29, Sarah had become an expert at hiding pain. Not just the physical kind, though she had plenty of experience with that too, but the deep emotional wounds that seemed to never fully heal. Each relationship had added another layer of scar tissue to her heart, making it harder to believe that love could be anything other than a trap disguised as affection. Her phone buzzed on the bathroom counter, and her stomach immediately clenched with anxiety. Derek's name appeared on the screen, along with a message that made her hands shake. "Baby, I'm so sorry about the other night. You know I didn't mean it. I love you so much it drives me crazy sometimes. Let me make it up to you tonight." Sarah deleted the message without responding, just as she had deleted the 17 others he had sent since their fight. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door, knowing that staying in her apartment would only give her more time to think about how she had ended up in this situation again. The graphic design studio where Sarah worked was located in downtown Portland, a 20-minute drive from her small apartment. As she navigated through morning traffic, her mind wandered back to how it all started with Derek. He had been charming at first, like they always were. Flowers on their second date, thoughtful texts throughout the day, and an intensity in his eyes when he looked at her that made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. The red flags had been there from the beginning, of course. They always were. The way he questioned her about her male coworkers, the subtle comments about her clothes being too revealing, the gradual isolation from her friends who he claimed didn't really care about her. But Sarah had ignored these warning signs, just as she had ignored them with Jason before Derek, and with Marcus before Jason, and with countless others stretching back to her first serious relationship in college. Her therapist, Dr. Patricia Williams, had helped her understand the pattern. Women who grew up without stable male figures often found themselves attracted to men who seemed strong and protective, not recognizing the difference between protection and control until it was too late. Sarah's father had abandoned the family when she was 8, leaving her mother to raise 3 children alone while working 2 jobs to keep them afloat. "You're looking for someone to fill a void that was created in childhood," Dr. Williams had explained during one of their sessions. "But you can't heal childhood wounds through adult relationships. You have to do the work yourself first." Sarah had been doing the work, or at least trying to. She attended therapy twice a week, read self-help books, and had even joined a support group for women who had experienced domestic violence. But knowing why she made these choices didn't seem to make it any easier to stop making them. The design studio was already bustling with activity when Sarah arrived. Her coworker and closest friend, Maya Chun, looked up from her computer as Sarah settled into her desk. "You look tired," Maya observed, her dark eyes studying Sarah's face with concern. "Everything okay?" Sarah nodded quickly, avoiding eye contact as she powered up her computer. "Just didn't sleep well last night. Too much caffeine." Maya wasn't fooled. The 2 women had worked together for 3 years, and Maya had watched Sarah cycle through relationship after relationship, each one following the same destructive pattern. She had tried to intervene before, but Sarah always insisted that this time was different, that she had found someone who truly loved her. The morning passed quietly as Sarah lost herself in work, designing a logo for a local restaurant chain. Creative work had always been her escape, a place where she could control every element and create something beautiful from nothing. Her talent was undeniable. She had won several industry awards and had been featured in design magazines. But success in her career only seemed to highlight her failures in her personal life. Around noon, Maya approached her desk with 2 cups of coffee and a determined expression. "Lunch break. Now." They walked to a small cafe 2 blocks away, settling into a corner booth where they could talk privately. Maya waited until Sarah had taken a few sips of her latte before speaking. "I'm worried about you," Maya said directly. "You've been different these past few weeks. Jumpy, distracted, and I noticed you've been wearing more makeup than usual." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her cheek where the bruise was hidden. "I'm fine, Maya. Really. No, you're not fine. And I think we both know why. Maya leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. This is about Derek, isn't it? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had become skilled at crying silently, another talent she had never wanted to develop. He's not like the others, Sarah said quietly, though even she could hear the lack of conviction in her voice. He really does love me. He just has a temper sometimes, and when he drinks. Sarah, listen to yourself. You're making excuses for him, just like you did for Jason and Marcus and all the others before them. Maya reached across the table and gently took Sarah's hand. You deserve so much better than this. You know that, right? Deep down, Sarah did know it. But knowing something intellectually and believing it emotionally were two very different things. Every morning, she woke up promising herself that she would end things with Derek, and every evening, she found herself answering his calls, accepting his apologies, believing his promises that things would change. The pattern was always the same. The honeymoon phase where he would be loving and attentive, followed by the gradual increase in controlling behavior. Then, the explosion of violence or emotional abuse, followed by desperate apologies and promises to change. Dr. Williams had drawn her a diagram of the cycle of abuse during one of their sessions, and Sarah had stared at it, recognizing every stage with painful clarity. I've tried to leave before, Sarah admitted to Maya, her voice barely above a whisper. But he always finds a way to pull me back in. And part of me is afraid that this is all I deserve. That maybe I'm just the type of person who attracts these kinds of men. Maya's eyes flashed with anger, not at Sarah, but at the circumstances that had led her friend to believe such a terrible thing about herself. That's not true, and you know it. You're kind, talented, beautiful, and generous to a fault. The fact that some men have taken advantage of those qualities doesn't mean you deserve to be treated badly. They sat in silence for a few minutes, both women lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Maya spoke again. Do you remember when we first started working together? And you told me about your dreams? You wanted to open your own design studio, maybe travel to Europe for inspiration, learn to paint watercolors. When was the last time you talked about any of those things? Sarah realized with a start that she couldn't remember. Somewhere along the way, her dreams had been replaced by survival strategies. Instead of planning for the future, she spent her energy trying to navigate the present without triggering another outburst from whichever man currently controlled her life. He says he wants to marry me, Sarah said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Derek. He's been talking about it more and more lately. He says we could move in together, start a family. And how does that make you feel? The question was simple, but it hit Sarah like a physical blow. How did it make her feel? Terrified, if she was being honest. The thought of being legally tied to Derek, of bringing children into their toxic dynamic, made her stomach turn. But she had been programmed to see marriage as the ultimate goal, the proof that someone truly loved her. I don't know, she said finally. Confused, I guess. Part of me wants to believe that marriage would change things, that he would treat me better if we made that commitment to each other. But another part of me is scared, Maya finished for her. Terrified, Sarah corrected. They walked back to the office in comfortable silence, both women processing the weight of their conversation. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on work, but her mind kept wandering to Maya's question about her dreams. When had she stopped believing that she could have the life she wanted? That evening, as Sarah drove home through the city streets, she made a decision. Instead of going straight to her apartment, she took a detour through the historic district, a part of town she rarely visited anymore, because Derek didn't like the pretentious hipsters who frequented the area. She parked in front of a small independent bookstore called Chapter and Verse that she had noticed many times but never entered. The warm light spilling from the windows looked inviting, and, for the first time in months, Sarah felt drawn to do something purely for her own pleasure. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, and Sarah was immediately enveloped by the comforting smell of old books and coffee. The store was cozy and well-organized, with carefully curated displays and handwritten recommendation cards tucked between volumes. Soft jazz music played in the background, and several customers browsed quietly among the shelves. Sarah found herself in the art section, running her fingers along the spines of books about painting techniques and art history. She pulled out a volume about watercolor landscapes and flipped through the pages, admiring the delicate brushwork and subtle color gradients. It had been years since she had painted anything, another casualty of relationships that demanded all her time and emotional energy. "That's a beautiful book," a gentle voice said behind her. "The author actually did a workshop here last month. We still have some of the pieces she created on display if you'd like to see them." Sarah turned to see a man about her age with kind brown eyes and slightly messy dark hair. He was tall and lean, wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans, and there was something immediately calming about his presence. Unlike the intense, almost predatory energy she had grown accustomed to in men, he seemed genuinely interested in sharing something beautiful with her, with no ulterior motive. "I'd love to see them," she said, surprising herself by accepting the invitation. He led her to a small alcove near the back of the store where several delicate watercolor paintings hung on the walls. The pieces were ethereal and dreamlike, capturing moments of natural beauty with remarkable skill and sensitivity. "They're incredible," Sarah breathed, studying a painting of a misty forest scene. "I used to paint, actually. Watercolors were my favorite medium." "Used to?" the man asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he understood the weight behind those two words. "What made you stop?" It was such a simple question, but Sarah found herself struggling to answer it. When had she stopped painting? Gradually, she realized, as each relationship had consumed more and more of her time and energy, leaving little room for the activities that brought her joy. "Life, I guess," she said finally. "Other priorities." He nodded thoughtfully, and Sarah had the sense that he understood there was more to the story but wouldn't press her for details. It was refreshing to meet someone who seemed comfortable with silence and unspoken truths. "I'm Michael, by the way," he said, extending his hand. "I own this place." "Sarah," she replied, shaking his hand and noticing how warm and steady his grip was. No pressure, no lingering, just a simple human connection. "Well, Sarah, if you ever decide you want to start painting again, we host a small art group here on Wednesday evenings. Nothing formal, just a few people who like to create things while surrounded by books. You'd be welcome to join us." The invitation was casual and friendly, with no pressure or expectation. Sarah felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Genuine excitement about the possibility of doing something just for herself. "That sounds lovely," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she was already thinking of reasons why Derek wouldn't approve. Michael smiled, and Sarah noticed that his eyes crinkled at the corners, suggesting someone who smiled often and genuinely. "Great. We meet at 7, and I'll make sure to have some watercolor supplies on hand, just in case." Sarah browsed for a few more minutes, eventually purchasing the watercolor book and a small journal with a leather cover. As Michael rang up her purchases, her phone buzzed with another message from Derek. This time, instead of the usual apologies, it was more demanding. "Where are you? I've been calling. We need to talk tonight." Her hands began to shake again as she read the message, and she noticed Michael glance at her phone screen before quickly looking away, his expression concerned but not intrusive. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly as he handed her the bag with her books. For a moment, Sarah considered telling him the truth. There was something about Michael that made her feel safe, like she could trust him with her secrets. But years of hiding had made honesty feel dangerous, and she fell back on her practiced smile. "Everything's fine," she said. "Thank you for showing me the paintings. And for the invitation. Of course, I hope to see you Wednesday." As Sarah walked back to her car, clutching the bag of books against her chest like a shield, she felt a strange mixture of emotions. The encounter with Michael had awakened something in her that had been dormant for too long, a sense of her own worth, a reminder of the person she used to be before she started defining herself through the men who claimed to love her. But along with that awakening came fear. Derek's message had been a clear reminder that her life wasn't really her own, that even a simple trip to a bookstore could be seen as a betrayal of his expectations. She thought about the art group Michael had mentioned, and her heart ached with longing for something she felt she could never have. By the time Sarah reached her apartment, Derek's car was already in the parking lot. Her stomach clenched as she saw him leaning against her door, and she took several deep breaths before getting out of her car. The bag of books felt heavy in her hands, and she considered hiding it in her car, but decided that would only make things worse if he discovered it later. "There you are," Derek said as she approached, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I've been waiting for over an hour. Where were you?" "I stopped at a bookstore after work," Sarah said quietly, hoping that honesty might defuse the situation. "I needed some new reading material." Derek's eyes narrowed as he took in the bag she was carrying, and Sarah could practically see the accusations forming in his mind. In his world, any activity that didn't involve him was suspicious, a potential threat to his control over her life. "A bookstore," he repeated flatly. "And you couldn't answer your phone because you were so busy looking at books?" "My phone was in my purse. I didn't hear it ring." The lie came easily now, another skill she had developed out of necessity. Derek stepped closer, and Sarah automatically took a step back, her body recognizing the signs of an impending explosion even before her conscious mind processed them. But instead of escalating, Derek seemed to make an effort to control himself, running a hand through his hair and forcing his voice to remain calm. "Look, baby, we need to talk about us. About our future together." He reached out to touch her face, and Sarah had to fight every instinct not to flinch away from his hand. "I know things have been rough lately, but I want to make it right. I want to make you happy." The words were familiar, part of a script Derek had performed many times before. But standing there in the parking lot, still feeling the warmth of Michael's genuine kindness, Sarah found herself seeing Derek's manipulation with new clarity. This wasn't love, it was control disguised as affection, possession masquerading as devotion. "I'm tired, Derek," she said, and for once, she wasn't referring to lack of sleep. She was tired of the cycle, tired of the fear, tired of living her life in service to someone else's insecurities. "I know, baby, I know. That's why I think we should take the next step. Move in together, maybe start thinking about getting married. I want to take care of you, protect you from all the stress in your life." The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. Derek was the primary source of stress in her life, the reason she jumped every time her phone rang, the reason she had learned to sleep lightly and always be ready to defend herself. But he genuinely seemed to believe that he was her protector, her salvation from a world that would hurt her. "Can we talk about this another time?" Sarah asked, fishing her keys from her purse with hands that she willed to remain steady. "I really am exhausted." Derek's jaw tightened, and for a moment Sarah thought he might push the issue. But then, he nodded, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, baby. You get some rest, and we'll talk tomorrow." "But Sarah?" He waited until she met his eyes before continuing. "I love you more than anything in this world. Don't forget that." As she watched him drive away, Sarah realized that those words, which should have been comforting, now filled her with dread. In Derek's mind, love justified everything. The jealousy, the control, the violence. It was a love that demanded she make herself smaller so that he could feel bigger, a love that required her to sacrifice her dreams so that he could feel important. Inside her apartment, Sarah set the bag of books on her kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. The simple act of buying them felt like a small rebellion, a tiny step toward reclaiming some part of herself. She thought about Michael's invitation to the art group, about the possibility of painting again, about what it might feel like to spend an evening doing something purely for her own joy. But even as she entertained these thoughts, she could hear Derek's voice in her head, listing all the reasons why such activities were selfish, why spending time away from him was a betrayal of their relationship. The voice had become so internalized that she sometimes couldn't tell the difference between his thoughts and her own. Wednesday evening arrived with an autumn chill that made Sarah pull her sweater tighter as she sat in her car outside Chapter and Verse bookstore. She had been parked there for 10 minutes, watching people come and go through the warm, lit windows, trying to summon the courage to walk inside. The past 3 days had been a careful dance around Derek's increasingly suspicious mood. He had called her repeatedly at work, stopped by her apartment unannounced, and questioned her about every interaction with male coworkers. When she mentioned needing to work late on a project, his response had been swift and cutting. "You're becoming distant, Sarah. I can feel you pulling away from me, and I don't like it. We're supposed to be a team, but you're acting like you have secrets from me. The accusation had stung because it was partially true. She was keeping secrets now, the books hidden in her bedroom, the business card for Dr. Williams that Maya had helped her get, and now this art group that felt like the most dangerous secret of all. Sarah checked her phone one more time. Derek thought she was at the grocery store, a lie that would buy her maybe 2 hours before he started calling. Her hands trembled as she turned off the engine and forced herself to walk toward the bookstore door. The same gentle chime announced her arrival, and Sarah was immediately struck by how different the space felt in the evening. Soft lamplight created intimate pools of warmth throughout the store, and the art section had been transformed into a cozy gathering space with easels, supplies, and several people already settled with their projects. Sarah, Michael's voice carried genuine pleasure at seeing her, and she felt some of her tension ease at his welcoming smile. I'm so glad you decided to come. Let me introduce you to everyone. The group was small and diverse. An elderly woman named Ruth who was working on a delicate botanical illustration, a young man named Alex sketching portraits, a middle-aged couple named Janet and Tom who were experimenting with abstract landscapes, and a woman about Sarah's age named Carmen who was painting what looked like memories of her childhood in Mexico. We're very informal here, Michael explained as he set up a small easel for Sarah and arranged watercolor supplies on a nearby table. No critique, no pressure, just the joy of creating something. Some people work on projects for weeks, others start something new each time. Whatever feels right to you. Sarah stared at the blank piece of watercolor paper clipped to the easel, feeling a mixture of excitement and panic. It had been so long since she had painted that she wasn't even sure she remembered how to hold a brush properly. But as she picked up one of the soft brushes and dipped it in clean water, muscle memory began to return. What calls to you? Ruth asked kindly, looking up from her detailed study of a lily. Sometimes the paper tells us what it wants to become. The question made Sarah smile for the first time in days. She remembered her art professor in college saying something similar, that creativity was as much about listening as it was about doing. As she stared at the white paper, an image began to form in her mind. A bird in flight, breaking free from a cage that was only partially visible in the frame. She started with the lightest washes of color, building up layers of blue and gray for a sky that suggested both storm and clearing. The bird took shape slowly, its wings spread wide in a moment of pure freedom that made Sarah's chest tighten with longing. That's beautiful, Carmen said softly, pausing in her own work to watch Sarah's painting develop. There's so much emotion in it. Sarah hadn't realized how absorbed she had become in the painting until Carmen spoke. Looking around the room, she saw that nearly an hour had passed, and her phone showed 3 missed calls from Derek. Her stomach immediately clenched with anxiety, and her hand began to shake as she set down her brush. Everything all right? Michael asked, appearing at her side with a cup of tea. I need to check my messages, Sarah said, her voice tight with stress. She stepped away from the group, moving toward a quiet corner of the store as she called Derek back. Where the hell are you? His voice was sharp with anger and something that sounded like panic. I went to 3 different grocery stores looking for you. I'm sorry, Sarah said automatically, her eyes finding her painting across the room. The bird looked so free, so hopeful. I stopped somewhere else after shopping. I'll be home soon. Where? Where did you stop? Sarah's mind went blank. She had been so focused on making it to the art group that she hadn't prepared a cover story for afterward. Just running errands. Nothing important. The silence on the other end of the line was ominous. Sarah, I can tell when you're lying to me. Your voice gets different. What aren't you telling me? Her heart was pounding so hard, she was sure he could hear it through the phone. Around her, the gentle sounds of the art group continued. The soft scratch of pencils on paper, quiet conversations about color and technique, the peaceful atmosphere of people pursuing their passions. It felt like another world, one where she could be herself without fear. I stopped at a bookstore, she said finally, deciding that a partial truth was safer than a complete lie. I was looking for some reference books for a work project. A bookstore. For 2 hours. His voice was flat, dangerous. Which bookstore? Sarah glanced around at the cozy space. At Michael who was helping Alex mix colors for a portrait, at Ruth who was adding delicate details to her lily. The thought of Derek's anger contaminating this peaceful place made her feel sick. Just a little place downtown. You don't know it. She was improvising now, trying to create a version of the truth that wouldn't lead him here. Look, I'm leaving now. I'll see you at home, okay? No, Derek said firmly. I'll come pick you up. Tell me where you are. I'm already in my car, Sarah lied, moving toward the door even as the words left her mouth. I'll be home in 20 minutes. She ended the call before he could respond and turned back to the group with an apologetic smile. I'm sorry, but I have to go. Family emergency. Michael looked up from where he was helping a customer select a book, concern evident in his eyes. Of course. Is everything all right? Yes, fine. Just, you know how families can be. The lie felt bitter in her mouth. She began gathering her things, carefully avoiding looking at her painting. The bird seemed to mock her now, its freedom highlighting her own captivity. Sarah, Michael said quietly, walking her toward the door. You don't have to explain anything to me, but I want you to know that this is a safe space. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, okay? There was something in his tone that suggested he understood more than he was saying. Sarah wondered if her fear was as visible as it felt, if her carefully constructed facade was fooling anyone. Thank you, she whispered, and impulsively reached out to squeeze his hand. For tonight, for making me feel welcome. It meant more than you know. The drive home was a blur of anxiety and regret. Sarah kept thinking about the painting she had left unfinished, about the gentle camaraderie of the art group, about how natural it had felt to hold a brush again. For one brief, shining hour, she had remembered who she was beneath all the fear and accommodation. Derek's car was already in her parking lot when she arrived, and she could see him pacing back and forth in front of her door. His body language was tense, aggressive, and Sarah took several deep breaths before getting out of her car, trying to center herself for whatever was coming. Where were you really? He demanded before she was even within arm's reach. And don't lie to me again, Sarah. I can always tell when you're lying. I told you, I was at a bookstore and then running errands. Sarah fumbled with her keys, trying to maintain the pretense of normalcy even as her hands shook. Derek stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath. He had been drinking while waiting for her, which never led anywhere good. Show me, he said. What? Show me what you bought. If you were really at a bookstore for 2 hours, you must have bought something. Sarah's mind raced. She had left her watercolor supplies at the art group, and her only purchases from her previous visit were hidden in her apartment. I didn't find anything I wanted, she said weakly. Derek's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. Right? So you spent 2 hours in a bookstore and bought nothing, while your boyfriend was worried sick about you, thinking something terrible had happened. I'm sorry, Sarah said, because it was easier than arguing. I should have called. Yes, you should have. But that's not really the problem here, is it? Derek moved even closer, backing her against her own door. The problem is that you're lying to me. The problem is that you're sneaking around, doing God knows what with God knows who, and then coming home to lie to my face about it. Derek, please. You're scaring me. I'm scaring you. His voice rose, and Sarah glanced around nervously, hoping none of her neighbors were witnessing this scene. What's scary is how you've changed. What's scary is feeling like I don't even know my own girlfriend anymore. What's scary is wondering what you're hiding from me. Sarah's key finally found the lock, and she pushed the door open, hoping that moving inside would defuse some of the tension. But Derek followed her into the apartment, his anger filling the small space like a toxic cloud. I'm not hiding anything, she said, setting her purse down carefully and trying to project calm. I just needed some time to myself. Is that really so wrong? Time for yourself? Derek's voice was incredulous. What am I, a stranger? We're building a life together, Sarah. That means we share things. That means you don't just disappear for hours without telling me where you're going or who you're with. The accusation hung in the air between them. Sarah realized that in Derek's mind, any independence on her part was automatically suspicious, evidence of betrayal rather than healthy autonomy. She thought about the art group, about how normal and natural it had felt to be around people who encouraged her creativity rather than viewing it as a threat. I wasn't with anyone, she said quietly. I was just exploring. Exploring what? Sarah hesitated, torn between her desire to be honest and her knowledge of how Derek would react to the truth. In that moment of hesitation, Derek's eyes narrowed, and she knew she had waited too long to answer convincingly. "You're lying again," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I can see it all over your face." "Who is he, Sarah?" "There's no one," Sarah said quickly. "Derek, please, you're imagining things." "Am I?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my girlfriend has suddenly developed a need for privacy, a need to disappear for hours at a time, a need to lie about where she's been and what she's doing. That doesn't happen in a vacuum, Sarah. That happens when someone else is in the picture." The paranoia in his voice was familiar and terrifying. Sarah had seen this escalation before, had lived through the process by which Derek's insecurity transformed any deviation from his expectations into evidence of infidelity. No amount of reassurance would convince him otherwise once the idea had taken hold. "There's no one else," she said firmly, looking directly into his eyes. "I love you, Derek. You know that." For a moment, something in Derek's expression softened, and Sarah thought she might have gotten through to him. But then, his gaze fell on something behind her, and his face hardened again. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to her kitchen table where she had left the bag from her first visit to the bookstore. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She had completely forgotten about the watercolor book and journal she had purchased, and they were sitting in plain sight, evidence of activities Derek knew nothing about. "Just some books I bought the other day," she said, trying to sound casual even as panic rose in her throat. Derek walked over to the table and pulled the items out of the bag. The watercolor book fell open to a page showing a delicate landscape painting, and the leather journal gleamed under the overhead light. "Watercolors." Derek's voice was quiet now, which was somehow worse than when he was shouting. "Since when are you interested in watercolors?" "I used to paint in college. I thought I might try it again." "When? When would you have time to paint?" "Between work and spending time with me." "When exactly were you planning to fit in this new hobby?" The question revealed the heart of the issue. In Derek's world, Sarah's time belonged to him, and any activity that didn't include him was automatically suspect. The idea that she might want to pursue something independently was not just threatening, it was incomprehensible. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "Maybe on weekends or evenings when you're busy with work." Derek flipped through the watercolor book, his jaw getting tighter with each page. "These are expensive books, Sarah. Professional supplies. This isn't some casual interest. This is serious equipment for someone who plans to spend a lot of time painting." "It was just an impulse purchase. I was feeling nostalgic." "Right." Derek slammed the book closed and turned to face her fully. "So let me see if I understand this correctly. My girlfriend, who claims to love me and want a future with me, is secretly buying art supplies and spending hours alone at bookstores, supposedly exploring herself. Does that sound normal to you?" Sarah wanted to scream that yes, it sounded perfectly normal, that healthy relationships allowed for individual growth and independent interests. But she also knew that arguing would only escalate the situation further. "I'm sorry if I worried you," she said instead, falling back on the appeasement strategies that had kept her safe in the past. "I should have told you about the books. You should have told me about a lot of things, apparently." Derek sat down heavily on her couch, his anger giving way to something that looked like hurt. "I feel like you're pulling away from me, Sarah. Like you're looking for reasons to spend time away from us. Is that what's happening here?" The question was loaded with danger. Sarah could see the trap. If she denied pulling away, Derek would demand proof of her commitment, probably in the form of moving in together or getting engaged. If she admitted to needing space, he would interpret it as confirmation of his worst fears. "I'm not pulling away," she said carefully. "I'm just trying to figure out who I am outside of work and our relationship. That doesn't mean I love you any less." It was the wrong thing to say. Derek's expression darkened immediately, and Sarah realized too late that she had essentially admitted to wanting an identity separate from their relationship. "Who you are outside of us." Derek stood up slowly, and Sarah instinctively took a step backward. "What the hell does that mean? You're my girlfriend, Sarah. We're building a life together. There shouldn't be some separate version of you that exists without me." "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant," Derek interrupted. "You want to be someone different, someone who paints pretty pictures and hangs out at bookstores and probably talks to other men who appreciate your artistic side or whatever bullshit they're feeding you." Derek, stop. You're being ridiculous. The word ridiculous was apparently the wrong choice. Derek's face flushed with rage, and before Sarah could react, he had crossed the room and grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her arms hard enough to leave bruises. Ridiculous, he snarled. Is it ridiculous that I love you enough to worry when you disappear? Is it ridiculous that I can tell when the woman I want to marry is lying to me? Is it ridiculous that I don't want to lose you to whatever fantasy life you're trying to create for yourself? You're hurting me, Sarah whispered, but Derek's grip only tightened. I'm trying to save us, he said, his voice intense and desperate. Can't you see that? All this secrecy, all this need for independence, it's going to destroy what we have. Is that what you want? Sarah looked into Derek's eyes and saw something that chilled her to the bone. It wasn't just anger or jealousy. It was a complete inability to see her as a separate person with her own needs and desires. In his mind, she existed solely in relation to him, and any attempt to define herself differently was an attack on their relationship. No, she said quietly, because it was what he needed to hear to let her go. I don't want to destroy us. Derek's grip loosened slightly, and Sarah could see him struggling to regain control of his emotions. This was the moment when he would typically pivot to apologies and promises, the part of the cycle where he convinced both of them that his behavior was justified by his love for her. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I'm so sorry, baby. I just love you so much, and the thought of losing you makes me crazy. You know that, right? You know that everything I do is because I can't bear the thought of living without you. Sarah nodded, because agreeing was easier than arguing, and because somewhere deep down, she had started to believe that this toxic intensity was what love looked like. She had been conditioned by years of similar relationships to equate jealousy with passion, control with caring. I know, she whispered, even as her shoulders throbbed where his fingers had gripped her. Those books, Derek said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. If you want to paint again, that's fine. But do it here, where I can see what you're creating. Better yet, we could take a class together. Make it something we share instead of something that takes you away from me. The suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface, but Sarah knew it was really another form of control. If Derek was involved in her artistic pursuits, he could monitor and influence them, ensuring that they never became a source of independence or confidence. Okay, she said, because resistance felt impossible in that moment. Good. Derek pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. We're going to be okay, baby. We just need to communicate better, be more honest with each other. No more secrets, right? No more secrets, Sarah agreed. Even as she thought about the art group, about Michael's kind eyes, about the unfinished painting of a bird breaking free from its cage. That night, as Derek slept beside her, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to process what had happened. The physical pain in her shoulders was nothing compared to the emotional weight of realizing how completely Derek controlled her life. She couldn't buy a book without explaining herself, couldn't spend an evening pursuing her own interests without it becoming evidence of betrayal. She thought about the other women in the art group, about how freely they had talked about their projects and their lives. Carmen had mentioned taking a weekend trip to visit family. Janet had talked about a solo pottery class she was taking. Ruth had described the garden where she grew the flowers she loved to paint. None of them seemed to require permission or approval for their choices. Sarah tried to imagine what it would feel like to live that Watu weeks past like a carefully choreographed dance around Derek's increasingly volatile moods. Sarah had become an expert at reading the subtle signs that predicted his emotional weather, the tightness around his eyes when he felt threatened, the way his voice dropped to a whisper when he was most dangerous, the false calm that preceded his worst explosions. The watercolor books remained on her kitchen table, but they had become decorative objects rather than tools for creation. Derek had bought her a set of cheaper supplies from a discount store, along with a beginner's instruction book that focused on painting simple flowers and landscapes. Perfect for practicing at home, he had said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Sarah had tried to paint with the new supplies, but everything felt wrong. The paper was too thin, the colors too harsh, and Derek's constant presence made it impossible to lose herself in the creative process. He would hover behind her, offering suggestions and critique, turning what should have been a meditative escape into another performance she had to manage. Work had become her only refuge, though even that was being slowly eroded. Derek had started calling more frequently throughout the day, sometimes just to chat, but often with pointed questions about her schedule, her coworkers, her lunch plans. Maya watched these interactions with growing concern, but Sarah deflected her friend's attempts to discuss the situation. "I'm fine," had become Sarah's automatic response to any expression of concern, a phrase she repeated so often that it had lost all meaning. But she wasn't fine, and the carefully constructed walls she had built around her emotions were beginning to crack. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when Maya approached her desk with unusual determination. "We need to talk," Maya said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Conference room. Now." Sarah followed her friend to one of the small meeting rooms, her stomach clenching with anxiety. Maya closed the door behind them and turned to face Sarah with an expression of barely controlled anger. "He hit you, didn't he?" Maya said without preamble. "What? No, he. Don't lie to me, Sarah. I've been watching you for weeks. The way you flinch when people move too quickly, how you're constantly checking your phone like you're afraid of missing a call, the bruises you've been covering up with makeup. I know what this looks like." Sarah's carefully maintained composure crumbled. She sank into one of the conference room chairs, her hands shaking as the weight of her secret became too heavy to carry alone. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "He doesn't mean to hurt me. He just gets so scared of losing me that he loses control sometimes." Maya sat down across from her, her expression softening with compassion but remaining firm. "Sarah, listen to what you just said. You're making excuses for someone who hurts you. That's not love, that's abuse." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Abuse. Sarah had heard it in therapy, had read about it in books, but applying it to her own situation felt impossible. Derek said he loved her, and his jealousy came from a place of caring, didn't it? "It's complicated," Sarah said weakly. "No, it's not," Maya replied firmly. "Love doesn't hurt, Sarah. Love doesn't make you afraid to pursue your interests or see your friends. Love doesn't require you to make yourself smaller so that someone else can feel bigger." Sarah thought about the art group she had abandoned, about Michael's text message that she had never answered, about the painting of the bird that she might never see again. Each loss felt like a small death, a piece of herself that had been sacrificed to maintain the illusion of Derek's love. "I don't know how to leave," Sarah admitted, the words falling from her lips like stones. "Every time I try, he finds a way to make me stay. And part of me is terrified that he might be right, that this is all I deserve." Maya reached across the table and took Sarah's hands in hers. "That's the abuse talking, not you. The real you, the woman I became friends with 3 years ago, is strong and talented and deserves to be cherished, not controlled. But what if I can't do it alone? What if I leave him and discover that I'm not capable of being happy by myself? Then you'll learn," Maya said simply. "But, Sarah, you're already alone. You're isolated from friends, cut off from your interests, living in constant fear. At least if you leave, you'll be alone with the possibility of something better." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing insistently. Derek's name appeared on the screen, along with a message that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Where are you? I came by your office, and they said you were in a meeting. Who are you meeting with? Call me back now." "He's here," Sarah whispered, her face going pale. "He came to my office." Maya's expression hardened. "You don't have to take that call. You don't have to answer to him about where you are or who you're with." But Sarah was already standing, her body responding to years of conditioning that had taught her to prioritize Derek's emotional state above her own well-being. "I have to go. If I don't call him back, he'll just get angrier." "Sarah, please. Let me help you. We can call someone. We can—" "No," Sarah said quickly, already moving toward the door. "I can handle this. I just need to talk to him." She left Maya sitting in the conference room, her heart breaking for her friend, but her body moving on autopilot toward the inevitable confrontation with Derek. She found him in the parking lot, leaning against her car with his arms crossed, and his face set in hard lines. "There you are," he said as she approached, his voice deceptively calm. "I was starting to worry that something had happened to you." "I was just in a quick meeting about a project," Sarah said, hating how defensive she sounded. Nothing important. With who? The question came quickly, sharply, confirming Sarah's suspicion that Derek had been asking questions at the reception desk. Maya. Just Maya. Derek's expression shifted slightly, recognizing Maya's name as someone who had never liked him and had occasionally encouraged Sarah to assert more independence in their relationship. What kind of project requires a closed-door meeting on a Friday afternoon? He asked, stepping closer to Sarah in a way that felt intimidating despite being in a public parking lot. Just work stuff. You know how Maya is about confidentiality. The lie felt flimsy even as Sarah spoke it, and she could see in Derek's eyes that he wasn't convinced. But instead of pushing further, he seemed to make a conscious decision to change tactics. You look stressed, baby, he said, his voice becoming gentle and concerned. You've been working so hard lately. I think we need to get away for a while, just the two of us. I was thinking about that cabin my cousin has up in the mountains. We could spend a long weekend there. No work, no distractions, just us. The suggestion sounded romantic on the surface, but Sarah heard the underlying message. Derek wanted to isolate her further, to take her somewhere where she would be completely dependent on him and cut off from any support system. The thought of being alone with him in a remote location made her feel sick. That sounds nice, she said automatically, but I have a big project deadline next week. Maybe we could plan something for later in the month. Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Sarah knew she had given the wrong answer. In his mind, choosing work over time with him was another sign of her pulling away. The project will still be there when we get back, he said, his voice carrying a hint of steel beneath the gentleness. But we need this, Sarah. I need this. Don't you want to spend time with me? The question was a trap, designed to make any refusal sound like rejection of Derek rather than a reasonable response to a work deadline. Sarah felt the familiar weight of manipulation settling over her like a heavy blanket. Of course I want to spend time with you, she said weakly. It's just, then, it's settled, Derek interrupted, his smile becoming warm and affectionate again. I'll make the arrangements. We'll leave tomorrow morning and come back Sunday night. It'll be perfect. As Derek drove away, Sarah stood in the parking lot feeling like she had just agreed to her own kidnapping. The thought of spending an entire weekend isolated with Derek while his jealousy and suspicion were running high felt dangerous in a way that made her chest tight with panic. She thought about Maya's words, about the possibility of getting help, of choosing a different path. But the practical realities felt overwhelming. Where would she go? How would she support herself if Derek carried out his occasional threats to make things difficult for her at work? What if she left and discovered that she really was as weak and incapable as Derek suggested? That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment trying to prepare for the weekend trip while Derek was at his weekly poker game. She had packed and repacked her bag 3 times, unsure what clothes would be appropriate for whatever version of Derek would emerge during their isolation. Her phone buzzed with another text message from Michael. I hope you're okay. Your painting is still here whenever you're ready for it. No pressure, just wanted you to know it's safe. The kindness in the message made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. Here was someone who barely knew her, yet he was willing to hold space for her creative expression without demanding anything in return. The contrast with Derek's possessive love was stark and painful. On impulse, Sarah found herself typing a response. Thank you for keeping it safe. I'm sorry I disappeared so suddenly. Things have been complicated. Michael's response came quickly. No need to apologize. Life gets complicated for all of us. The painting will be here whenever you're ready. And so will we. The simple acceptance in his words broke something open in Sarah's chest. She realized that she had been living in a world where every interaction was fraught with judgment and consequence, where expressing a need or desire automatically triggered conflict. Michael's easy kindness reminded her that relationships could be different. Sarah looked around her apartment, taking in the careful way she had arranged everything to minimize Derek's potential triggers. Her books were organized exactly the way he preferred, her furniture positioned to create clear sightlines so he never felt like she was hiding anything from him. Even her art supplies had been relegated to a corner where they wouldn't serve as reminders of her independent interests. For the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what her space might look like if she decorated it purely for her own pleasure. Art on the walls, books scattered on tables, flowers in vases simply because they brought her joy. The image was so appealing and yet so foreign that it felt like looking at someone else's life. Her phone rang, Derek's name appearing on the screen along with his photo, a picture she had taken during their early, happier days when his intensity had seemed romantic rather than frightening. "Hey, baby." Derek's voice was warm and affectionate, the tone he used when he wanted to remind her why she had fallen for him in the first place. "Just wanted to hear your voice before I headed home. Are you excited about our trip?" "Yes," Sarah said, because it was what he wanted to hear. "I love you so much, Sarah. I know things have been tense between us lately, but this weekend is going to fix everything. Just you and me, no outside influences, no distractions. We can remember why we're perfect together." After Derek hung up, Sarah sat in her quiet apartment and tried to remember the last time she had felt genuinely happy. Not the temporary relief that came from avoiding Derek's anger or the brief satisfaction of completing a work project, but real joy. The kind of happiness that came from being authentically herself rather than constantly performing an acceptable version of who she thought she should be. The memory that surfaced was from the evening at the art group, sitting in the warm light of the bookstore, losing herself in the act of creation while surrounded by people who encouraged her expression rather than analyzing it for threats. That version of herself, confident, creative, engaged with the world, felt like a person from another lifetime. Sarah pulled out her laptop and, before she could second-guess herself, began typing an email to Dr. Williams, the therapist Maya had recommended. The cursor blinked for several minutes as she struggled to find words that captured the complexity of her situation. Finally, she typed, "My friend Maya gave me your contact information. I think I need help, but I'm scared. Is it possible to schedule a consultation to discuss my situation? I can be reached at this email address, but please don't call my phone." She hit send before she could change her mind, then immediately felt a mixture of relief and terror. Taking this step felt like crossing a line from which there might be no return. Derek had made it clear that therapy was for people who can't handle their own problems, and he would view her seeking help as both a betrayal and an admission that their relationship was fundamentally flawed. But as Sarah prepared for what felt like the most dangerous weekend of her life, she held on to the hope that Dr. Williams might offer her tools for finding her way back to the person she used to be. The bird in her painting was still trapped for now, but perhaps it was finally ready to test the strength of its cage. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Sarah's mood as she waited for Derek to pick her up for their trip to the mountains. She had received a brief email from Dr. Williams offering an appointment the following Tuesday, which Sarah had quickly accepted before deleting the message from her phone. Derek arrived 30 minutes late, his mood already showing signs of strain from traffic and the weather. "This is going to be perfect," he said as Sarah got into his car, but his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "Just what we need to get back on track." As they drove through the city and toward the mountains, Sarah watched the familiar landmarks disappear in the rearview mirror. Each mile felt like another step away from the possibility of escape, another degree of separation from the people and places that might offer her support. Derek kept up a steady stream of conversation during the drive, talking about his plans for their weekend, his ideas for their future together, his vision of the life they would build. But Sarah noticed that all of his plans involved her becoming more integrated into his world rather than him making space for her individual identity. "I've been thinking about us moving in together," Derek said as they wound through mountain roads bordered by tall pine trees. "My lease is up at the end of next month, and it would be so much easier if we were in one place. We could get a nice apartment together, maybe even start looking at houses." The suggestion landed like a weight in Sarah's chest. Living with Derek would eliminate her last sanctuary, the one place where she could still maintain some semblance of privacy and independence. But she could already hear in his voice that this wasn't really a suggestion, it was a plan he had already decided upon. "That's a big step," Sarah said carefully. "It's the natural next step," Derek corrected. "We love each other. We're committed to building a future together. Living separately just creates unnecessary opportunities for misunderstandings and distance." Sarah understood the subtext. Derek believed that her independent living situation was what allowed her to have secrets from him, to pursue interests he didn't approve of, to maintain friendships he considered threatening. Moving in together would give him complete access to monitor and control every aspect of her life. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was small and isolated, exactly as Sarah had feared. Set back from the road and surrounded by dense forest, it felt less like a romantic retreat and more like a place where no one could hear you scream. "Isn't this perfect?" Derek said as he carried their bags inside. "Complete privacy, no neighbors, no distractions. Just us." Sarah forced a smile and agreed. But privately, she was calculating distances to the nearest town, wondering if she would have cell phone service, trying to assess how quickly she could reach help if Derek's mood turned violent. The first few hours passed peacefully enough. Derek seemed determined to recreate the romance of their early relationship, cooking dinner together and building a fire in the stone fireplace. But Sarah could sense the underlying tension in his forced cheerfulness, the way he monitored her responses to gauge whether his efforts were having the desired effect. As evening fell and they sat by the fire, Derek pulled out a small velvet box that made Sarah's heart stop. "I know this isn't the most traditional setting," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I couldn't wait any longer. Sarah, you're everything to me. You're my whole world, and I want to make that official." He opened the box to reveal a diamond ring that was larger and more expensive than anything Sarah would have chosen for herself. But she could see in Derek's eyes that her personal preferences weren't really the point. This ring was a symbol of ownership rather than partnership. "Marry me, Sarah," Derek said, taking her hands in his. "Let me spend the rest of my life loving you and protecting you from everything that might hurt you." The proposal should have been the moment every relationship was building toward, the culmination of their love story. But sitting there in the isolated cabin, looking at the ring that felt more like a shackle than a promise, Sarah felt nothing but trapped. "Derek," she began, but he interrupted her before she could form a complete thought. "I know what you're going to say," he said, his grip on her hands tightening. "You're going to say it's too soon, or that you need time to think about it. But, Sarah, we've been together for over a year. How much more time do you need to know that you love me?" The question was loaded with danger. Saying she needed time would confirm Derek's worst fears about her commitment to their relationship. But accepting his proposal felt like sealing her own fate, legally binding herself to someone who had already demonstrated his willingness to use physical force to maintain control. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, stalling for time while her mind raced through possible responses. "I'm just surprised. Overwhelmed." Derek's smile became strained at the edges. "Surprised? We've talked about marriage before. We've talked about building a life together. This shouldn't be surprising. This should be the happiest moment of your life." Sarah looked at the ring again, noticing how the diamond caught the firelight and threw it back in sharp, brilliant flashes. It was undeniably beautiful, and undeniably expensive, and undeniably a trap designed to look like a gift. "Can I think about it?" she asked quietly. The question hit Derek like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and Sarah could see him struggling to contain his anger in the face of what should have been a joyous moment. "Think about it," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You need to think about whether or not you want to marry the man who loves you more than anything in the world." "I just want to be sure." "Sure of what?" Derek's control snapped, and he stood up abruptly, the ring box falling to the floor. "Sure that you love me? Sure that you want a future with me? What exactly are you unsure about, Sarah?" Sarah remained seated by the fire, every instinct telling her to stay small and non-threatening. "I'm not unsure about loving you," she said, which was partially true. She did love Derek, or at least she loved the person he could be when he wasn't consumed by jealousy and possessiveness. "I just want to make sure we're both ready for such a big commitment." Derek began pacing in front of the fireplace, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Ready? I've been ready since the day I met you. I've been building my whole life around the idea of us being together forever. What the hell have you been doing?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the fire, acrid and choking. Sarah realized that in Derek's mind, her reluctance to immediately accept his proposal was proof of all his worst suspicions about her loyalty and commitment. "That's not fair," she said, her own anger finally beginning to surface. I'm allowed to want time to consider a major life decision. Time, Derek said bitterly. Time to what, exactly? Time to figure out if there's someone better out there? Time to explore your independence a little more before settling down with me. Sarah stood up slowly, recognizing the signs that this conversation was spiraling toward violence. Derek's face was flushed, his breathing rapid and shallow, his body language aggressive and threatening. I think we should table this discussion until we're both calmer, she said, trying to project a composure she didn't feel. Calmer? Derek laughed harshly. I'm supposed to be calm about my girlfriend rejecting my marriage proposal? I'm supposed to be understanding about the woman I love treating my offer to spend our lives together like it's some kind of burden? I didn't reject it, Sarah said quickly. I just asked for time to think. Same thing, Derek snarled. And before Sarah could react, he had crossed the room and grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into the same spots he had bruised weeks before. Do you have any idea what this feels like for me? Do you understand what it's like to love someone so completely and have them act like that love is negotiable? Derek, you're hurting me, Sarah said. But this time he didn't loosen his grip. I'm hurting you. His voice rose to a shout that echoed through the small cabin. What about how you're hurting me? What about how it feels to have the most important question of my life treated like an inconvenience? Sarah looked into Derek's eyes and saw something that terrified her more than his anger. She saw a man who genuinely believed that her autonomy was an attack on his love, that her need to make her own choices was a fundamental betrayal of their relationship. In that moment, she understood with crystal clarity that Derek would never see her as an independent person with her own rights and desires. To him, she was an extension of himself, and any deviation from his expectations was experienced as a personal assault. The realization gave her a strange kind of clarity. This was not a man she could reason with or compromise with or hope to change through patience and understanding. This was a man who saw her independence as a threat to be eliminated rather than a quality to be cherished. For the first time in their relationship, Sarah stopped trying to manage Derek's emotions and simply spoke her truth. I can't marry you, she said quietly. The words fell into the cabin like stones into still water, creating ripples of consequences that Sarah knew would change everything that came after. Derek's grip on her shoulders tightened to the point of real pain, and his face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, rage, and, finally, something that looked almost like grief. What did you just say? He whispered. I can't marry you, Derek. Not now, not ever. This isn't love, this is control. And I can't live like this anymore. The silence that followed Sarah's words felt heavy with possibility and danger. She had finally spoken the truth that had been building inside her for months, and now there was no taking it back. Whatever happened next would determine not just the immediate future, but whether she would find the courage to reclaim the life that Derek had slowly, systematically stolen from her. Outside the cabin, wind moved through the pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out into the darkness, its voice wild and free. Why? To make decisions based on her own desires rather than someone else's insecurities. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and contemplating flight. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and Sarah's heart stopped when she saw Michael's name on the screen. I hope everything is okay with your family emergency. You left your painting here. It's beautiful, and I'll keep it safe until you can come back for it. Sarah stared at the message for a long time, knowing she should delete it, but unable to bring herself to do so. Someone had seen value in her work, had thought it worth preserving. When was the last time Derek had expressed genuine appreciation for anything she created? She thought about the bird in her painting, wings spread wide in a moment of pure freedom. Somewhere in that image was the person she used to be, the woman who believed she deserved to fly. The question was whether she still had the courage to remember how. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the watercolor book on her nightstand like a promise she wasn't sure she was brave enough to keep. Outside her window, the city hummed with life. People living freely, pursuing their passions, making choices based on their own desires rather than someone else's fears. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what that kind of freedom might feel like. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down at the vast unknown below. But somewhere in that unknown was the person she used to be, the woman who dreamed of traveling to Europe and learning to paint and opening her own design studio. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would go to the art group on Wednesday, just once, just to see what it felt like to do something for herself again. It was a small step, but perhaps it could be the beginning of finding her way back to the person she was meant to be.